Good evening and welcome. We are so very happy you could join us for our April AWL Advocates for Free Methodist Women in Leadership event with Dr. Kayleigh Clark. I cannot wait to hear what she has to say. I know I'm going to find it valuable in a world that's kind of filled with trauma. Tonight, to give you an order of events, we're going to open in prayer in a moment. We're going to hear more about AWL, how you might get involved, and what kind of things we do in advocating for our incredible women leaders. We're going to listen to Dr. Clark, and we're going to have some Q&A time at the end. And for that, I'm asking you to put your questions in the chat by hitting that chat button on the bottom of your screen. We will not be stopping in the middle to answer questions. We're going to do that at the end. I'll be consolidating them, trying to get the most asked questions. So we hope we cover yours this evening. So grab a snack and a drink and enjoy. And I'm turning it over to Roberta.
Please join me as we pray. Almighty God, we are gathering today, this evening, and we are inviting your presence. We are asking you to come, asking you to hear our prayers, asking you to be very present with us. We are praying for the Free Methodist Church. We are asking for your will and your way. We're asking for pastors specifically, as we know so many are under a heavy burden of stress, and we know that ministry is hard during this season. So we're asking for a special grace and a special blessing, a special awareness of your presence as to how we might be more aware and how we might help one another. So during this event, we're trusting you to speak. In Jesus' name, amen.
Hi, everyone. My name is Janet Richards. I sit near Seattle, Pacific Northwest Conference. I'm BOA chair of the Pacific Northwest Conference. I also am a CMC candidate who will be getting ordained in May. And I am on the steering committee of Advocates for Women in Leadership. A little bit about what we do. Well, you're here, and so you are at one of the things that we spend some time doing. We believe that it is important to have a space for us to focus on conversations that matter to women in leadership. And that doesn't mean that it's exclusively for us. We welcome everyone, because we believe this is information that everyone should have. But we are particularly attuned to conversations that we hear from women in leadership. Another big thing that you may have seen on social media that we do is our quarterly preacher events. We believe that it makes a difference in the church when people see women preaching. And some people have never seen a woman preach. And so we work with conferences and superintendents and leaders to make space for women to preach. And, one of the things that we do is we have a calendar where we're like, if there isn't any other time that you have a woman preaching in your church, here's some suggestions on some dates where it will be great to have women preaching. And then the last thing is I will put in the chat a link to our website. There's resources on there. There are videos of women preaching. So if you want to share in your conference potential women who can preach, there's some videos on there. There's many, many other resources. And so definitely, if you have not visited the site, please do so. Sign up for our regular email, and please engage with us. We'd like to have you active in our community. Thanks.
I'm muted. Hey, it's good to see everyone here tonight and some of those who have yet to appear by visual screen, but we're glad to have you. I'm going to introduce to you Reverend Dr. Kayleigh Clark, and what an inspiration and an encouragement she has been to me in just appearing in one of her um, uh, presentations at WHWC. I do want you to know that she's a pastor, an elder, and a pastor's kid. She is intimately acquainted with the mess of beauty, pain, joy, and heartache that exists within the church. One of the things that she is her unrelenting hope is that the church is the community through which God seeks to restore the world. And that fuels her in her ministry and led her to start Restory. And so, as she comes tonight, she's going to be talking to us about the struggles and some of the things that maybe you aren't even aware of as a pastor when it's time to take a break. So, I just want to introduce to you Dr. Kayleigh Clark and turn this over to her. You'll find that she has a website, and it is www.restorycenter.com, and you can reach her on Facebook. So thank you, Dr. Clark. We're glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so good to be here. Yeah, so I am a pastor's kid. I'm a pastor's granddaughter. My grandpa's here. My grandpa, so there are men in the room. His grandpa came. And so yeah, I've been around pastors my whole life, and I deeply love pastors. And so I do a lot of work with collective trauma in congregations. But today, what we're going to be talking about is just the secondary and vicarious trauma that pastors can carry. And so the title of today's session that you signed up for was Encouragement for the Weary Pastor. And so you signed up for that. And so that either means that you are a weary pastor or know a weary pastor, or there's something in you that is stirred to know more about how to encourage the weary pastor. And so if you're coming here tonight and you're tired and you're burdened and you're carrying a lot, I want you to know that you are seen and you are known, not only by us in this room, but just the reminder that we are known and seen by Jesus, who deeply cares for us. And it can be really easy when we get into the business of shepherding other people to forget that there is a good shepherd who is seeking to shepherd our own souls. And we can busy ourselves with all of that and forget that there is somebody who is there to care for us too. So hopefully tonight you feel encouraged and supported, and maybe even understand a little bit more regarding the burdens and the weariness that you feel in your body and in your soul and in your mind. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and have some slides for you all. If you want these slides, I can get them to the steering committee and they can get them to you if that is something that you would want. But yeah, so I want to just start with telling you that today we are going to be talking about trauma. And so what I want to do is I want to center ourselves a little bit, because when we talk about trauma, and I'll be giving examples and stories from my own life of ministry and some different examples from research. And sometimes it can stir things in us and it can cause our bodies to tighten and it can bring memories back or cause some tension. And so I want you to be aware of that as we go into this. And I want you to know that this entire webinar segment is an invitation to care for yourself well. And so if at any time while I'm presenting, you feel your shoulders start to tighten or you feel something in your gut, or I tell people mine always happens in my forehead if I start to like kind of scrunch my eyebrows together or feel some tension in my forehead. I want you to be able to notice that and do what you need to do to take care of yourself. So if you need to walk away from the Zoom screen or mute me. You can mute me. I won't be offended if you need to just take a break from what is being said so you can do some of your own processing. That is completely okay. if you need to go get a drink of water or whatever you need to do to attune to your body and what is happening in it. God has given us these bodies and they communicate with us, right? And we want to be attentive to what God is saying through our bodies. But what I want to do is I want to start us with a breath prayer because it can be helpful in those moments when we start to feel tension gathering, to just be able to return to our breath. So in scripture, the word for breath is often connected to the word for the Holy Spirit. And so our breath is this reminder of the presence of the Holy Spirit with us. And so wherever you are, if you can find a comfortable seat, if you can kind of sit up in your chair, put your feet on the floor, and just start to become aware of your breath. If you want, you can close your eyes, and we're going to slow our breath down. So you're going to, breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth. And just start to slow your breathing down. And then as you breathe in, we're going to start adding this breath prayer. And so as you breathe in, you can say, Prince of Peace. And as you breathe out, say, be present to me. Prince of Peace, be present to me. You just take a couple more deep breaths here. And so I offer that breath prayer to you tonight as a place to just root yourself and center yourselves as we talk about some of the burdens and weariness of ministry. So that's just something you can return to at any point, whether that be tonight or in tomorrow's board meeting or whatever you have to walk through this week. Maybe you need to just root yourself in some of those moments. So I want to start with two stories. I call it kind of the tale of two worlds. When I was in college, this is before I had decided that I was going to follow the call of God into ministry. And so I was receiving my degree in psychology and focusing on child development. And I had an internship in a children's hospital. And I was serving as a child life specialist. And my job was very simple. I was to go in and play with the children and help them feel better through some laughter and some play. Very, very simple. I had no medical training. I was there to just encourage them and support them emotionally. And so I was working on a unit with a lot of babies and some nonverbal children. And I went into a room to play with a little baby. And he was sitting up in a chair and I was shaking a rattle and we were just playing. And all of a sudden this child went blue in the face and just stopped breathing. And again, I'm not there as a nurse or a doctor. I have no medical training. And so I do the only thing that I do know how to do in my training, and I hit the call button, right? And so the nurses flood in, the doctors flood in. I'm pushed out of the way because I have nothing to offer at this point. And they go into what they know to do, and they're able to resuscitate the baby, and the baby is fine, and they're able to bring the baby back to health. But in that moment, my supervisor, my internship supervisor, came and found me. And she said, I need you to go take a break. And so I went and it was a Catholic children's hospital. And so they actually had a prayer garden out and back. So I went and I walked around this prayer garden and I took some deep breaths and then I came back in and I finished out my day. And the next day when I came in for my next shift, my supervisor, found me and called me into her office and we debriefed that situation and what that was like for me and kind of talked it through. And there were all these touchstones to make sure that when I endured what was a highly elevated, could have been traumatic situation, that I was taken care of, right? And so there were all of these parts to make sure that I had time and space to process it. Now, again, I'm like fourth generation clergy, so I'm very familiar with the other story from a different world, where a pastor is called to the hospital and somebody has passed away. And they are immediately there to take care of the family. Even if the person who passed away is a congregant, somebody that they've discipled, somebody that they've shepherded, somebody that they've loved deeply, somebody who they themselves are grieving the loss of, they are immediately thrust into the role of caring for the family and shepherding that family through that really dark season. And as they do that, they are then shuffled into funeral preparation conversations, and they're navigating conversations with funeral home directors and with family members and the tensions that that can sometimes bring. And pastors are holding all of that together. And so then Friday comes and they do the viewing, and then Saturday comes and they do the funeral, and then Sunday comes and this pastor is preaching a sermon. And then Monday comes and they're back at it, right? And nobody is telling this pastor, you need to go take a break. And nobody is calling this pastor and saying, hey, can we debrief how that was for you? What was it like to come to the hospital and have to know that a congregant that you loved and discipled so deeply is now gone? When are you going to grieve? Have you done your grieving yet? Have you done your crying yet? And this is just what we have called normal. And so if you talk to pastors who have been around for a while, I mean, this is just how ministry works, right? This is just how it goes. This is the pace and the rhythm of ministry is this nonstop processing and helping other people process their pain while we don't have any room to deal with our own, particularly when it's connected to the suffering of the people that we're shepherding. The unfortunate part of all of this is that what we call normal in pastoral ministry is anything but normal, right? In every other sector of the world, there is training and opportunity for and instruction on how to take space and process and care for yourself so that you can be in those caretaker positions for the long haul. But unfortunately, that's not happening in pastoral ministry. At least not always. And so the question is, well, what can we do? And what is this rhythm of ministry? What is this doing to us as pastors? And so a lot of people will talk about burnout in pastoral ministry. And burnout has, when it's been studied, it's been kind of broken down into these three components of what causes and leads to burnout. The first being emotional exhaustion. So that's when you're in your job and you're just getting not just only physically tired, but you're just emotionally exhausted. You're weary to a deep soul level. And in that emotional exhaustion, that will eventually lead to this depersonalization. And so you kind of start to check out of your job. You're not as personally invested in it. You don't care as much. You don't feel like you can relate on a personal level to the work in which you're doing. And then this leads to a lowered sense of accomplishment. And I think this is really important to note the language that they chose in studying burnout and kind of depicting this journey is that it's not necessarily actual lowered accomplishment. So you might be outputting the same amount of work, but internally you just don't feel like you're accomplishing what you know you can. Now, these are the three components that are connected to burnout for any career. But can you see how this might be particularly important in ministry, right? It's one thing to feel depersonalization in your work if you do IT, right? It's another thing to feel depersonalization in your work if you're discipling people and if you're journeying with people and if you're shepherding people. I mean, you need to have that personalization. You need to feel that investment, that relationship with the people you're working with. And so we can get to a place in our ministry where we're feeling this emotional exhaustion that's leading to this depersonalization. And then even if we're still showing up and we're preaching every Sunday and we're still showing up to all the meetings and we're still checking off all the boxes, internally, we don't feel like we're accomplishing what we're called to do. And this kind of leads to what has been called burnout. But what I want to point out is that when we treat ministry burnout as just burnout, we miss the deeper root cause And I really believe that that is the secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma. So what is causing this emotional exhaustion in pastors, in clergy? It's not just that we're getting tired of all of the different emotional things we're dealing with, right? There is actually something going on at a deeper level that is this secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma. But what are these things? So secondary trauma is the natural consequent behaviors and emotions resulting from knowing about a traumatizing event experienced by a person. And these symptoms are almost identical to those of post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, note that this definition just says resulting from knowing about, right? And we all know, as pastors in ministry, we don't just know about what other people are going through, right? We're invested in it. We're walking with them through it. We're journeying with them through it. We're with them in it, right? And so when you're journeying with people through traumatizing events that they're experiencing, you can end up developing secondary traumatic stress disorder, which has symptoms that are almost identical to post-traumatic stress disorder. So if you're not familiar with post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, this is what is often seen in individuals who have experienced a very traumatic event. This was first discovered in the study of veterans and soldiers returning from war is kind of what narrowed it down and developed this diagnosis. And so they were diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. And so what was happening is they were coming home from war. The original diagnosis or term that was used was just shell shock, but then they figured out there was more going on, right? And so what was happening is they would come back from war and then they would be in an environment, whether it be a fireworks show or something, and all of a sudden all of the stress and the trauma of combat would come flooding back. And so post-traumatic stress disorder is connected to heightened anxiety, continued sense of perceived threat, nightmares, and flashbacks, and all of these things. And secondary trauma can actually cause those things as well. And so there are times when we end up walking with people through really, really just tragic scenarios, and we end up developing these symptoms that are similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, and we didn't go through it ourselves, but we've walked with somebody closely and we've journeyed with them through it. And they've actually shown, research has shown that your risk for developing secondary traumatic stress disorder is higher the more empathy you have for the person suffering. Which means pastors, we are at high risk, right? Because you want an empathetic pastor, right? We need to be empathetic people who can love people and experience what they're going and be compassionate towards them and feel related to them and journey with them and Jesus became incarnate, right? And so we want to see how we can be with them and let them know that Jesus is with them in those places. And this level of empathy and compassion for people who are suffering raises the risk of developing secondary trauma. Now, some statistics on this that you may find interesting, and this is kind of why, right? This will show you why this can be so prevalent in pastors. It's because that we are frontline workers, right? So we're first responders in many ways. Okay, and so other people who develop secondary traumatic stress are first responders. And in many ways, that's what we are. We show up at the beginning of the event. We're called to the scene of the crime or the emergency room or whatever it is. And these statistics are helpful, I think. So following 9/11, 59% of individuals said that they would seek help, seek religious help. And there's other research that says that 42% of people facing any kind of problem will use clergy as a source of support. In fact, some research shows that people are more likely to go to a pastor before they go to a counselor, right? And we know that a lot of people are coming to our churches in the midst of crisis and hardship. And so they're seeking our help. And so we're carrying a lot of suffering for a lot of people. And in one study, 22.9% of clergy had developed secondary traumatic stress. And so that's the secondary trauma that has those symptoms that I talked about earlier that are similar to post-traumatic stress. Now, there's also vicarious trauma, which has often resulted from what is being talked about as trapped arousal. And so, vicarious trauma is not as severe necessarily as secondary traumatic stress disorder. So, you might not have the flashbacks or the nightmares. You might not have those symptoms of PTSD. But there's still a way in which the trauma that you're walking people through, the deep suffering that you're walking people through, is impacting your body, your mind, and it's creating that emotional exhaustion that starts the kind of path towards burnout. And so trapped arousal is something that's newer. It's being there was newer studies last year out of Regent University that were beginning to study this in therapists, licensed therapists, and other clinicians that work in the mental health field. And they described it this way. So trapped arousal takes place when you are witnessing the trauma of another, and in your own body, you experience a trauma response to which you are unable to attend. Okay, so what is a trauma response? So there are many of them. There are many ways that our bodies, which are all different, will respond to suffering and threat around us. Some of the key ones that are often talked about are the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And so when we're approached with a crisis, when we have a threat before us, when we have some kind of suffering, our body, what happens is in our brain just starts to operate differently. And so our brain, which is supposed to operate as this very integrated part of who we are, begins to operate where some will talk about how we flip our lid. So basically, you have the amygdala part of your brain, and that is the part of your brain that is designed and wired by God to know how to respond to a threat. Now, it's supposed to work in conjunction with the rest of your brain, including your prefrontal cortex, to kind of be able to assess what kind of threat is happening and what's the best way to respond and all of those things. What happens in trauma is that the amygdala just takes over the show and it's just calling all the shots. And it's just responding to the threat without allowing the rest of your brain to process your level of safety, what you need to do. And so we end up operating out of these trauma responses, and they look like either fight, which is we're going to fight it. We're going to come at the threat, or it's flight. We're going to get out of there. We're going to remove ourselves from that position. We don't want to be around the threat. Or it's going to be a freeze response. And so we kind of become frozen. We don't know what to do. We're kind of paralyzed in the situation. We're not entirely sure how to respond. And a new trauma response that many are kind of starting to study is that of fawning. And so sometimes we fawn. And so we think, how can I appease this threat? How can I please that which is threatening me so that it stops being a threat? The fawning response is often seen in childhood victims of trauma, and so children who have experienced abuse, as well as adults who are in abusive situations. When you've learned to appease the one who's harming you, then that becomes your trauma response. And so what trapped arousal is it's when you are witnessing the trauma of another and you're pastoring, right? So let's consider you're doing kind of a pastoral counseling, you're journeying with somebody's coming to you, they want to share their story with you. And they start sharing this story of great harm and something that's happened to them that's been really devastating. And in your body, something about their story touches something within you that tells your body, like, we need to get out of here, or we need to stop this threat. We need to, you want to fight it, you want to flee it, you're freezing, you're shutting down. And that's happening in you. But you're shepherding this person, you're pastoring this person, so you can't take your pastor hat off. So you can't show any of that in your face. You can't actually get up and run out of your office, though that may be tempting in the moment, right? Like you have to sit there with this person in their story and carry it. And so you just kind of shove that trauma response down and you don't attune to it. You don't do anything with it because you just are trying to stay present to the person who is sharing their hurt with you. This is what we call that trapped arousal. This is what's happening to the pastor in the emergency room who is comforting the grieving family and kind of pushing her grief down, right? This is what's happening when we're in those situations where the suffering of another person, we're there to attend to it. And so we can't attend to what's happening in our bodies. The problem is what happened in your body, just because you pushed it down, just because you didn't respond to it, doesn't mean it goes away. It's still in your nervous system and it's just trapped there. It's this trapped arousal. And so this is the metaphor that is helpful for this for me is that of the trauma closet. Okay, so if you can picture this wardrobe, kind of like the one that I've got on the screen there, with a bunch of stuff falling out of it, right? So the more that we go through these situations where we are caring for the trauma of other people, and we're journeying with them through their suffering, and we're trying to hold them in that pain, and the more we do that while just kind of shoving our own responses down and we never process them, the more our internal lives, our souls, our minds will look like this wardrobe. And things are just going to start kind of oozing out of it. And then what happens is all it would take for this wardrobe on the screen to kind of just bust open would be a really slight kind of tap on the side, right? And the door would come out and the clothes would start flooding out. And that's all it would take, right? And so when we start shoving all of these trauma responses and all of this grief and all of our own personal suffering that we're experiencing because of the suffering we're walking other people through, when we start just shoving that down, we're basically creating this kind of wardrobe in our hearts and minds and being so that when something maybe little happens, we burst open and all of this kind of comes out. And that can lead to this journey of burnout where we just don't feel like we depersonalize because we don't have it anymore. And so then we think we're burning out and we think it's just because we're doing too much, when maybe what's happening is our own personal, emotional, spiritual closets are just ready to explode. And so what is more helpful to do is you're right, you can't actually do anything. You can't do a lot of things in the moment. You can do little things, and we'll talk about that. But when you're in the moment and you're walking somebody through it, you can't respond to your body's desire to just flee your office, because that would not work, right? You can't respond to your body's desire to just start shouting and trying to right the situation and fight the threat that seems to be in front of you, because that's not what you're supposed to do either. So there is a moment where you have to kind of shove that down. But what we want to do is we don't want to leave it kind of shoved in there. We want to hang it on a coat hanger. We want to fold it up. We want to put it away so that it's not threatening to bust out of our closet, right? And so that can look like very different things for different people. Um, but you want to find ways where when you leave that situation and you have time on your own, so you leave the hospital visit and you have time on your own, you don't just immediately start going to the next ministry thing, right? Or you don't just start going to grocery shopping or, whatever is next on your task list for the day. But you want to see, okay, that moment in that hospital room caused me to feel this tension and this sense of threat. So now I need to figure out a way to process that. And so, do you take a walk? Do you do some deep breathing? Do you have a friend or a family member who you can call and process it with? What is the thing that you can do to help fold that back up and put it neatly back in the closet? Because the truth of the matter is these situations are going to happen. We're going to find ourselves in places where we are going to have these emotions and these responses in the ministry that we've been called to do. And so to help us keep going for the long run, we don't want our closet to be something that can just be knocked and easily explode, right? We want it to have things kind of put back in the way that they're supposed to go. We want to care for ourselves because that's what Christ is inviting us to do, is he wants to care for us and shepherd us through that. And if we don't, this trapped arousal, as I said, it leads to this heightened anxiety. It continues the perception of a continued threat. And so that word perception there is really helpful with trauma. Trauma is difficult. It's different than suffering because suffering, you just kind of move through it. Um, but trauma makes you seem like you're in kind of this perpetual sense of threat. Now, the physical threat could actually have been removed, right? Like the situation's over. But your body, your nervous system still has this perception of a continued threat, which leads to that heightened anxiety. You can have flashbacks or nightmares. You can have physical manifestations of stress, right? So, migraines or constant tightness in your back and shoulders or digestive issues. Or when I was in high school and way too much of a perfectionist who cared way too much about her grades, I broke out in stress hives during the SATs. Thought I was allergic to something, went to my doctor. She went, "You're too stressed." I said, "Okay." So there are our bodies tell us when we're stressed, right? So when we don't process the trauma and the grief that and the suffering that we're walking through, especially that we're walking other people through, it can build up within us and create these symptoms. Now, I want to talk about three other forms of trauma. So I've focused primarily on secondary trauma and vicarious trauma. But I do want to recognize that there is trauma that's not secondary in ministry. So it's not just trauma that we're witnessing other people walk through. It's trauma of our own that we encounter when we're in ministry. And it can be really burdensome and it can cause us to be really weary. And I think it's important to recognize that and to recognize that God is there and he sees that as well. And he does want to shepherd that. He doesn't just want to shepherd us from the trauma that we're experiencing because we're walking with other people, but he wants to care for our souls in these areas of trauma. And so for people of color in ministry and in life in general, there is racial trauma that can be experienced. And it was during our pre-conversation talking about this, Janet was sharing a little bit. And this is racial trauma is not my own experience. I don't have an experience of that. But I do recognize, and she was helping us kind of all recognize, right, that there is a way in which often you're carrying your own trauma, but you are also seen and known to be a safe place for other people who have a similar story. And so like the way we were talking about earlier today, when people are going to come to you, and that's another layer of pain and suffering that may be shared. And because they recognize that you may have an understanding that other people in the room don't, and so you're seen as safe. And so there's another layer of trauma there on top of the carrying the racial trauma and experiences that we're seeing in our world today, and the weight of all of that. And that just compounds itself and adds to the weariness. There is the unique trauma of being a woman in ministry. And I think in this space, there's ability to acknowledge that and recognize what that can often feel like, to, have those situations that are really devastating and harmful and to carry some of that and to not necessarily know where and how to process it and to have those stories of pain, where you are, discredited or even called sinful. I think that that's a burden a lot of us have carried and have heard. And so processing that. And then on a similar note, often as women in ministry, we are perceived as safe in many ways. I have found that as a woman in ministry, those who've experienced spiritual abuse are more comfortable talking to me than they are talking to a male pastor, even if that male pastor is very healthy. I don't look like and resemble the people who hurt them, right? And so there is something about being a female in ministry that puts you in a position to receive the stories of those who have been spiritually abused. I also think that as women in ministry, we are often uniquely positioned to receive stories of sexual abuse. And I think that that is a secondary trauma that we often have to process and carry as well, as we will often be entrusted with those stories of great harm, because there is safety in. So while we have our trauma of what has been said to us to prevent us from being in ministry, our being there and our being faithful to the call opens us up to additional secondary trauma because people will trust us with stories they may not trust our brothers in ministry with. And then I do want to note religious trauma as well. So, religious trauma is growing in study right now. And basically, religious trauma is summed up as any trauma that is experienced within a religious relationship or community or system. And so, for some of us, we've experienced trauma within while doing ministry, and it's been within our congregations. And it's been really hurtful and it's been hard to work through, and that this can be religious trauma. Um, and so processing it as such and asking the questions of how has this impacted my relationship with God? How has this impacted my relationship with the church? How has this impacted how I navigate those spaces, and where and how might God bring healing to that specifically? I think is important to recognize. So I do want to be hopeful. I don't want to just give you all these facts and statistics about how traumatizing ministry can be. So there is hope because, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, there is a good shepherd who desires to care for us and who recognizes what trauma is, who created our bodies and our minds and knows exactly how these things impact us. And so I want to offer you kind of some suggestions for care, for how you can care for yourselves. First, learning to attune to your whole self. So, your body, your soul, your mind, and your relationships. I think as pastors, we can get really good at attending maybe to just our soul or just our mind, but remembering to attune to ourselves as whole people can be a little trickier. So when I say attune, I mean being able to pay attention to what our bodies are communicating to us. What are they telling us? So are they telling us anything? Are they giving us those messages that, hey, you're stressed, hey, you're weary? Are our relationships feeling depersonal? Are we not able to connect with people really well? When you're in a trauma response, your ability to connect to people is limited because you're responding to threat, like constant perceived sensation of threat. And so being able to really recognize, okay, any of those signs within yourself that things are not the way they should be, that something is a little bit off, can be helpful in knowing when and how you need deeper care. And then learning ways to respond to your body in the moment. And so that's what I kind of mentioned earlier. So when you're working with somebody, when you're ministering to somebody and they're sharing this story with you of deep hurt or pain, or if you're in a hospital room and you're doing that hospital visitation, or when you're in one of those situations and you can't respond to your body in the way that you really want to because you have to keep that shepherding role on. There are some things that you can do to still help digest that trauma in the moment. And so therapists who, again, receive a little bit more training in this than we do, they're helpful in reminding, like, even small things, like just kind of, you can't all see my feet because we're on Zoom. But if you can imagine, if you can just like tap your feet like one or the other, like there's something about, so there's bilateral movement is really helpful. That's why walking can be really helpful for processing therapy or processing trauma. And so in the moment, you can't like get up and go for a walk. But if you can kind of tap your feet kind of back and forth to start doing that bilateral movement for your brain, it starts to help the brain come back together. Just slowing your own breathing down communicates to your body that it's safer than it feels in that moment. You can, tap your fingers lightly on your leg. And then sometimes it's just good, if you're in a pastoral counseling situation specifically, even just to offer the person you're walking with a time of breath prayer or a time of centering prayer where you both are slowing your breath down together and you're both, kind of attuning to the presence of God together, like we did at the beginning, that can help your own body deal with what's going on there and probably help the person you're serving and you're shepherding deal with what's happening in their own body as well. But then once you're out of that space and you're on your own and you can do a little bit more to respond to your body, you want to find ways to continue to do that. Basically, what are the ways that you can begin to fold up the laundry in your wardrobe or hang up the laundry in your wardrobe? And so it's different for everybody. I am a big proponent for therapy. I think every pastor should have a therapist. And ideally, mostly for even if you're like, I'm fine, I don't need one, you need one because of the job you have. Okay, so if that's the only reason you go, my therapist, when I started with him, I told him one of the reasons that I, wanted to see him was because of the work that I do. I spend a lot of time helping churches process trauma and grief, and that's heavy. And I can't necessarily always talk about it because there's confidentiality things. And so I do think that therapy is really important for pastors to have and to engage in. And therapists are also really good at providing tools and ways in which to respond to your body and take care of yourself. They're in a similar role, right? Where they're having to process these emotions and these sensations not in the moment necessarily, right? Because they can't respond to it when their client is sharing with them what they want to process. But so they are a wellspring of resource. And then, but you might know other ways that are really good. I mentioned walking. So walking is a bilateral movement that can be really helpful to helping your brain kind of start talking to all the parts of your brain start talking to one another again. Um, doing some stretching that involves deep breathing. Your breath is really essential. The Lord gave it to us, and there's something really powerful about slowing your breath down to communicate to your body that you are safe. Having a community of people to talk with, to share with, and as much, as you can without breaking confidentiality. All of these things can just be really helpful. And then finally, doing all of this in community with other people. So the question on the screen is, who is your compassionate presence? And so there is a quote about trauma that I really appreciate, which says that trauma is not what happens to us, but what happens inside of us in the absence of an empathetic witness. That's Peter Levine. And I think that that's helpful in recognizing that trauma is very relational and it is often connected to a sense of, being alone in suffering. And so we are being a compassionate and empathetic witness to many people as pastors, and we're offering to them that to them regularly. And so we need to know who is our compassionate presence, who can be there for us, who can we you know, let know like that we're not, that our body is giving us this message of threat. And we know we're not really in threat, but we can't seem to tell our body that. And who can help kind of process that with us? We were created for co-regulation. The Lord created our brains in that way, where I am going to be able to regulate my nervous system more if somebody who is regulated is with me and doing that with me. It is actually way more effective. We see that in babies, and that doesn't go away just because we're grown-ups. Okay, so we are able to co-regulate much quicker than we can self-regulate, and so it's good to have somebody else who is able to give us that eye contact, whose breathing can be slow, who in all of those just bodily ways can communicate to our brain and body, okay, I can begin to regulate now. And so who is that for you? And so these are kind of the four components in this caring for yourself, right? Is this attuning to your body, learning ways to respond to your body in the moment, continuing to respond to your body, and doing all of that in community. And so I will stop sharing now, and I think we have about 10 minutes for questions.
Well, currently we have only one question that I can see. So feel free to continue to write more in there. But this question is it possible to write that trauma quote here in the chat? I would like to write it down. Yeah, I love that too.
Yeah. I'm working on it.
Should have brought the reading glasses if I was in charge of the chat.
All right, it is in there now. And yes, I will send the slides to somebody. Denise, maybe somebody will have them and they'll be able to get them to you.
Katie is the one who gets things out.
Katie gets things out. Awesome.
How often do you think we should talk with a therapist?
Um, so I think that depends on how much you're working through. Um, I personally meet with my therapist once a month, though there are seasons where I'm more at a bi-weekly or weekly. It really is so season based. And so in times when I'm processing maybe more of my own personal anxiety or um, life change or that kind of thing on top of what I'm walking other people through, then I'm maybe going a little bit more often. Or if you're in the midst of some really devastating suffering with your congregation, you may need to go more often. I will say that therapists are very good at gauging that too. So if you start with a therapist, they're probably going to want to meet kind of on the weekly to bi-weekly basis just so you can get a rapport going. And then once you do, they're very helpful in going, okay, well, I think, we can go to a bi-weekly or I think we can be at monthly now. And and then they might go, can you come back up sooner? Like they're very good at kind of gauging that. And so I would trust their guidance in that.
Yes. Thank you. I'm going to get back to you, Denise, but I really want to get to the next question because I think that is something that we need to talk about. Are pastors more likely than others to helping professionals to experience burnout, etc.? Do you think the tendency to over spiritualize our trauma might keep us from getting help or using tools?
Yeah, so thank you for asking that. That is, so actually, yes. So burnout started being researched in the 1970s. And like there's a lot of kind of misnomers that clergy burnout is connected to COVID. No. So when burnout started being studied in the 70s across multiple careers, clergy were also always at the top at risk level for burnout. We just have always been up there. I think it's for multiple reasons. I do think that some of it is the spiritualizing it of the suffering, also the normalizing. So like I said at the beginning, like we've just called this, it's just ministry, right? So if you describe that situation at the beginning, it's just like, well, that's just ministry. That's how it works, right? Um, and there's the spiritualization of trauma and suffering in general, where it's like, well, we only try to deal with it at maybe a spiritual level, and we don't necessarily deal with it at a more holistic approach kind of level, which God designed us in this more holistic way. So we want to make sure that we're looking at it from all these different angles. I also would say that, especially now in 2026, this was probably not true in the 70s, but it's definitely true now. We're not trained in it. So I have a sister who's a licensed mental health therapist. Like she gets training in secondary, like she knows that she's at risk for secondary traumatic stress. When I do this presentation for pastors, most of them have never heard of it before, right? And so there's a vast difference in our training and our prevention, which I think is a key reason why we are probably at a higher risk of burnout.
That kind of leads into Denise's questions that you mentioned in your other presentation that pastors sometimes just don't recognize
Yeah.
that they are involved, that they care during
Mhm.
these events. And can you tell us what happens in that case?
Yeah, so I think what often the not recognizing it, right? Like so because we're just doing what we know we're supposed to be. We're just doing our job, right? And so we think we're just doing our job. Um, and we get really good at it. Like we get really good at going from one thing to the next thing to the next thing. Um, and we're often given this language of burnout. And so that's just kind of what we think is happening. If we think anything is happening, we think maybe we're just getting burned out. We've put too many things in our calendar. We try to approach it from a self-care perspective, instead of realizing that there's a deeper layer of trauma, of this secondary trauma happening. And so what what can be helpful in recognizing it in ourselves is again being able to attune to our bodies, right? So recognizing when our breathing is getting maybe shallow, recognizing when we're carrying more tension in our bodies, recognizing when we're not relating to people well, recognizing when we're maybe detaching or withdrawing. Just being able to recognize all these different signs that our body is giving us can help us remember, okay, this is deeper than just feeling burned out, or this is deeper than just feeling tired, or this is just, and so recognizing those things and caring for that, I think is helpful.
Thank you. Um, well, now all the questions are coming in when we only have time for maybe one or two more. um, how do we know we need a break in ministry if we're feeling burned out?
Yeah, I think if you're um, starting to really detach, and maybe kind of just going through the motions in a way that's kind of numb, um, and having that real just um, or so either that, so it depends. See, this is where it gets complicated because every person is so different. So for some people, it's going to feel a lot like detachment and numbing and kind of just going through the motions. Then some people, the way you're going to know you're going to need a break is if you approach everything like with this heightened anxiety, right? And so everything is needs to be a fight. Like there's this tension about everything and everything is go, go, go. And there's this heightened anxiety and this sense of threat. You walk into a meeting and you're automatic, every meeting you're guarded. Every meeting, every email that comes in, you're like ready to go, ready to fight, right? Like so it depends on your personal makeup how to figure that out. But you want to look for those trauma responses that I mentioned before, those that fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Figure out which one you kind of go to, and then start asking yourself, like, is that happening more than it's not? Am I interacting with ministry more from that posture than one of rest and ease and, comfortability? That would be if you are, then you probably want to take a step back, right, and take a break. You need a break from ministry all the time, though. That's the other part. That's like, make sure that you have regular breaks from ministry, that you're able to do things that are fun and life-giving and move your body and, help process all of the weight that ministry gives you. But as far as like a long break, any kind of like sabbatical type thing, would be more, am I operating out of those trauma response moments?
All right, I'm going to ask one more real quick. We have 1 minute for um, can you talk more about the depersonalization in burnout versus setting boundaries, which maybe looks like the same thing but isn't?
Yeah, I would say that that's very internal, right? So depersonalization isn't really boundary setting. It's not like, okay, I need to. make sure I'm not answering my phone at all hours of the day because I need to sleep. It's not, okay, this person is, you know, clearly becoming codependent on me and I need to draw some boundaries and, meet with them less often or that kind of thing. It's more internally like you're not personally connecting to the person. Like you're having a difficult time being there as your whole self. Like you're not showing up because you're starting to it's more of an internalizing of you shutting down and not being able to interact, not necessarily you drawing boundaries so that those interactions are healthy. It's you literally are just so emotionally exhausted and weary that when you enter into those conversations, you're not all there. Like you're partially checked out. You know that you're not able to be the pastor you want to be in that situation. And that may be due to the person you're meeting with, or it may just be because you're weary and tired and it has nothing to do with the person you're meeting with, right? So I would say they're very different. You want those healthy emotional boundaries. You don't necessarily want to kind of go into relational spaces already kind of partially checked out or numbing yourself to the relationship before you.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Clark.
Yeah.
Um, and thank you, everyone who attended this evening. We will be getting those slides out to you, and we appreciate having had you here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So that ends our meeting.